My name is Scott Schall. I'm Chair of Architecture here at LTU, and I have the great privilege of introducing our speaker tonight. Bryan Bell comes to us as, from Design Corps in Raleigh, North Carolina. I first came in contact with Bryan actually at the 3rd Structures for Inclusion Conference, a conference that he, through Design Corps and the National Endowment of the Arts, if I'm not mistaken, a Graham Foundation, host a conference around the idea of what I call socially responsive design, what is you've called within a publication activist as architecture. Different names, the intent remains the same. And I've always found it to be a fascinating conversation. Those of you that have not had the opportunity to look up Structures for Inclusion, I urge you to do so. Just don't go to 3, because that's the one I spoke at and I don't want to be embarrassed. But the other ones were fantastic. The other thing I want to point out is Bryan comes to us having a range of experiences in terms of teaching at the University of Illinois, at NC State, at Auburn, having spent a bit of time with Stephen Hall, working with Samuel Mockbee, the founding director of Rural Studios and one of the inspirations behind my own work. And then Richard Rogers as well. He has been exhibited at the Biennale. He's earned the La Trobe Research Prize, featured in Dwell and ID magazine. A truly decorated person, and I would argue one of the most eloquent and powerful thinkers on this topic, and it's truly a great honor and a privilege to be able to have him here today. Stick around afterwards. There will be a brief panel discussion on public interest design. I will be a part of that, as will Gina Reinhart, and founder, director of Design 99, and June Kim will be kind enough to moderate that panel discussion. So thank you, Bryan.
Thank you, Scott, very much. Thank you for having me. I wanted to thank the Dean and the lecture committee of Chair Schwartz and, I'm sorry, Chair Dynas and Professor Martin Schwartz for having me. And of course, the teachers of the PID class here, June Kim and Dorian Moore. So thank you. And I got to say that this is the first time I've ever been anywhere that used the same acronym PID that I use all the time, which stands for Public Interest Design, which is what I'm going to be talking about tonight. So that was kind of a little thrill for me to hear my favorite acronym. So I'm going to start off by talking about something that some of you can relate to is how I got started. But first I'd like to just give you a sort of a statement, sort of a context statement. Architecture and the design professions have so much unrealized potential. We could be doing so much more for so many more people. I believe, and I think what you'll see tonight as evidence, is that design can play a role in addressing the most critical social, economic, and environmental issues we face in the world today. Architects and designers have been absorbed in what we can accomplish technically, structurally, and aesthetically. We're making progress in what we can do environmentally. Where we have failed is to show what we can accomplish socially and economically. We can do much more to help communities and individuals. We can help them reshape their existence, whether in recovering from disasters or meeting daily needs. I really believe this is a very exciting time for designers. While it may seem challenging in the job market, I think you have an amazing opportunity for something really great happening in design. So tonight I want to talk about the expansion of design, an expansion that can transform our identity and transform the consciousness about who we are and what we do. Now, this is not something I'm making up or proposing. It is already happening with real projects that help real people face-to-face encounters on the streets and in the fields. This is basically happening in 3 main ways: serving more of the public, taking on a greater range of issues, and offering a greater scope of services. We have limited ourselves by who we accept as clients and what issues we deal with. So the first expansion, serving a larger segment of the public, is getting a lot of attention. Oops. More people talk about and do something about changing the practice of design, which today serves only the few, the elite, the wealthy and the powerful. I have used this statistic that only 2% of new homebuyers work with architects. This is sort of our rallying cry. If you're familiar with this, that's great. It's meant a lot to this movement over the last 10 years. The Cooper Hewitt has also used this. I used this in 2000 at the first Structure for Inclusion, and the Cooper Hewitt had a wonderful show in 2006 called Design for the 90%. But regardless of which statistic you use, the point is design can serve more of the population. The second expansion is design taking on a greater range of issues. And probably the most important thing I want to say tonight is that every issue is a design issue. This is something that I think is transformative for us to believe and to provide evidence that every issue is a design issue. So this expanded practice is what we're calling public interest design. And as Scott said, there have been many names, and I'm going to talk about why public interest design is an important name with differences to it. So tonight I'm going to talk about this growing practice and an emerging field of public interest design. I'd like to present this in the context of what has happened already, where we are now, and where this could go. I will be basing this on my own 22 years of work and 12 years of research of other people's work, most recently with a wonderful opportunity through the AIA of the Latrobe Research Prize. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of my own story, and I think for those of you who are about to enter the job market or in the job market, this might be of interest. This is really how I got started and how it's been a paid career for me for 22 years. My path was sort of typical in some ways. Graduated from Yale, like all my classmates, wanted to go to New York City. Like a lot of my classmates, wanted to work for Stephen Hall. Got the job I wanted in the world, which is pretty lucky, of course. But after about 6 months there, I realized, I said to myself, if this is architecture, I don't want to do architecture. And the reason was, I felt like what we were doing was not important. And I really felt like I wanted to find a way of being meaningful and relevant. Now, we thought it was very important, and a lot of other people thought it was important. But let me give you an example. I can give you many examples, but here's one. So we were doing a project called Edge of the City for Phoenix, Arizona. It was funded by the Graham Foundation for the Advancement of the Fine Arts. It was going into MoMA. It did go into MoMA. Nobody in our office had ever been to Phoenix, Arizona, okay? It never occurred to any of us to even call up and ask anybody in Phoenix, Arizona about the edge of their city. And this is when I began to think, something's wrong with this. We may be fooling some people, but somehow this isn't fooling me. I really don't think this is what is meaningful. It's not really addressing meaningful issues. So I had a midlife crisis 6 months out of school. I did stay there for 365 days. But my sister was out in central Pennsylvania inspecting migrant housing. And she was sharing with me what she was encountering. And it just occurred to me, I was like, maybe I could do something meaningful out there. So I moved to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, not because of the battle, but because it's apple country. And let me just ask you all. You moved to Adams County, Pennsylvania. You have an idea that you want to serve migrant farm workers. Anybody have an idea of what you might do to try and find a job? I didn't have an idea either, so it's okay. No guesses? All right. Well, all I could think of doing was calling up the housing authority. There's a housing authority in most rural counties. And I'd heard a rumor that they were doing migrant housing. They wouldn't talk to me. All I wanted to tell the executive director was, I want to volunteer. I want to come in and learn. Wouldn't even talk to me. So it was real good for my Yale ego. You know, the guy wouldn't even take my volunteer time, right? But one thing that happened that was really lucky for me, I got a $2,500 grant from the AIA. And I was able to stretch that out for about 4 months and spend the time inspecting migrant housing. And this is Adams County. It's a beautiful place. I mean, it's an inspiring place. So it was really fortunate. And so I spent the $2,500 inspecting migrant housing, trying to take the opposite approach of Stephen Hall's office. Instead of saying, we know everything about everybody, and we don't need to ask, I tried to say, I don't know anything about migrant farm workers, and I need to learn. So I worked with legal services and spent time inspecting migrant housing, which is really bad. Outhouses meet code in migrant housing, for example. 50 square feet per person. So in 800 square feet, you can house 16 people. So you can imagine that. So this is some of the photographs I took. At the same time, I finally got through the executive director. He said, you don't want to talk to me, you want to talk to Rural Opportunities. So he said, they're building migrant housing. So I called them up, and so what would anybody have an idea what you might do? You're calling up a nonprofit, you want to work with them. You know, they're not going to care that you're an architect. In fact, the guy there said, let me tell you what we think about architects. They build Taj Mahals to themselves that blow the budget. Okay, this is the guy I'm trying to work with, right? That's his preconception of what I am. So anybody have an idea of how you might pitch something to them? Well, now that I had learned about grants, I said, well, let's go after a grant together. I'll write the grant. You tell me about migrants. I'll come up with a design. Let's try and get a grant together. And what do you think he said? He basically said, what the hell? You know, he had nothing to lose. So this is sort of, the activist aspect of what I do is very important. So I want you to get an idea that I didn't find a job opening to design housing for migrant workers. You have to sort of, you know, this is not a place where there are a lot of architects and a lot of jobs. So in terms of a career path in this field, you need to sort of make it happen yourself. You need to understand what you have to offer, how you can partner with somebody, and how it might be beneficial to them or at least not do any harm. So they actually said back to me, well, you know, we've got this job. It's called a housing developer. And I was like, oh, God, that sounds awful. I don't know if I can call myself a housing developer. He said, well, it is for it is affordable housing for migrant workers. So I said, fine. And this is what I said to him. I said, I will do your job description 40 hours a week, and in overtime, I will do design. And after 2 years, if design is important to the job, it becomes my 9 to 5. And he said, fine. And you know, I was only working they only wanted 40 hours. I was working 70 hours in New York, so I had all this time to kill. Didn't know what to do with myself in Adams County, Pennsylvania. So anyway, that's what happened. They gave me the job. The first thing they asked me to do was to go out to a site and see how many houses we could put on the site. So I was doing, and it was really wonderful because the office had experts all up and down the hall. We had migrant health, migrant education, migrant Head Start, migrant housing, migrant job training. So I had this incredible knowledge bank of things. If I wanted to find out about tuberculosis spreading in housing, I could walk down the hall. So it really was a wonderful way of learning about migrants. At the same time, the design opportunities were wonderful also. This wasn't like being in Stephen Hall's office where we're all fighting for like a little scrap of design. This was like nobody else wanted to do design. It's like, oh, you want to do design? You got it. So it was very different dynamic than being in a New York office where there's, a designer every square foot. So what I learned so I stayed there 5 years. And what I learned was how affordable housing is built and funded in this country. I found out there are billions of dollars of programs every year. Building housing is just not design priority in it. It's just your basic building. One of the great programs we worked with was actually started in 1935. Dorothea Lange was actually hired to promote the need for this program. There's her photograph used in some of the promotional posters of the Resettlement Administration. That later became Farmers Home and is now called Rural Development, and that's who funds a lot of rural housing. So that's what I learned. At the same time, I was just working in this beautiful area. And so what we found out was that the worst housing is called a bullpen. Basically a big room like this, put hundreds of guys. And that was by far the worst. The best housing was small units where a family or single guys could come and move right in. So the social unit was already formed. They'd moved right in together. And one of the things I'd say to farmers is, look, if I'm living with 99 guys, I'm not going to go in and clean the bathroom. But if I'm living with four of my friends, we take turns. We say, hey, Scott, your turn to clean the bathroom, right? And so the first units we did were 2-bedroom units. You see here, I didn't know much about manufactured housing. We really didn't get much design into it. We got a porch and some nice Galvalume siding. So here are the first units I did at Rural Opportunities. What I learned was farmers, really there are two different groups of farm workers, families and single guys. They actually have very different values. The families really want to settle out of the stream and so their children can get a good education. The single guys want to come and make some money and then go back home. So one is very about stability and the other is about mobility. So we designed a unit specifically for the single guys. I'm not going to go into it too much, but here you see just another. So after a couple of years of doing this, I started getting calls because if you pick a niche like this, nationally there's not a lot of other people architects doing migrant housing. So I got a call from Florida. They said, we just had 2 hurricanes, wiped out some migrant housing across the state. Can you come down and design, this is in 2004 before Katrina. He said, we're getting a lot of federal money coming. Can you design a unit that would be good permanent housing, not just bad temporary housing? And I want to show you this and this interior. These are units that weren't damaged by the hurricanes, okay? So really bad anyway. So, and they paid us to do the design. They said, here's $10,000 and here's our design for them. So that was used for the federal money, but then what we found is we could actually sell this. We got this down so, the first time we had it priced, $75,000. We took it to a 3rd-generation place called Townhomes, same specs, down to $45,000. And that was so low that we could actually sell these without any government subsidy, and we'd actually add $5,000 on per unit. We came up with a great set of contracts where we own the intellectual property, but we have no liability. So, so this is one way we're making a business of this. We're selling this product. Another thing I'll say about developers, in a HUD project, an architect makes 6% of construction. Let me tell you something, developers make 20%. You also get a 10% indirect rate. So instead of being the architect end of the deal, being the developer, designer, we actually control 36% of the project cost. So that allowed not only us to get paid more, but 20% of that money we'd put back into the project, and we got things like an upgrade in siding and other features like that. Here's some other housing we've done. I'm not going to go into it because I want to kind of move on to my next point. So after I did this between 1990 and 2000. Then in 2000, a lot of us started to realize, hey, there's a lot of people doing this. Why don't we learn from each other? So this is when we had that first conference called Design for the 98%, and has gone on to be Structures for Inclusion, where we'll be holding our 13th in Minneapolis in March. But what's happened over the last 10 years is there's been this collection of evidence that has been very important. And here's some of the books that have been out. There's also been the exhibits. So what have we learned, and where are we now? What we have learned, the evidence shows that what I said is true, that every issue is a design issue. You can look in those books and find drinking water. You can find things like disaster response. But more important than addressing a single issue, the projects that are most successful are the ones that address multiple issues, because then you get a bigger bang for your buck. For example, disaster relief. Let's look at this project. This is after the tsunami in Japan. Tsunami in Sri Lanka. And the original proposal from the government was to move everybody in 3 miles from the shore. That's how they were going to respond to a disaster. Well, MIT and Harvard worked on this house, which is basically all shear walls. And it can resist the lateral force. So the house remains. Obviously, you evacuate the people. But the entire economic and social history of this culture had been at the beach. So if you move them back 3 miles, you may prevent a disaster. I mean, if you only allow them to build 3 miles back, but you've wiped out their social and economic infrastructure and culture. So this is not just disaster relief. This also addresses social and economic issues. A great story about this, one of the students on this was coming to speak at Structures for Inclusion. And I said, well, how's the project doing? He said, I don't know. I said, well, can you find out? So he called up the monk that they had worked with. And the monk said they'd built 400 of these houses. So the point I'm trying to talk about here is, why does the 98% care? I mean, right now, the 98% is getting along happily without us. If we don't show our value to them, they're going to continue to get along without us. Now, what is critical about showing our value is if we show our value, that's when we get paid, okay? And very much why I use the term public interest design is because I'm talking about a profession. And just like public interest law, public interest medicine, it is a profession. It is not it's not pro bono, it's not just something you do in school, it's a profession. So that's why, to me, public interest design is a very important term. I also would like to propose to you that layering these multiple issues that communities face is one of the highest and best uses of our creativity. I mean, here's a project. Their challenge is wildlife preservation and tourism, okay? We want you to preserve the chimpanzee population by bringing people to see them, but the people coming to see the chimpanzees also infect them and they die, okay? That's your challenge as a designer. Go solve that, would you? Well, these guys did. This is a mobile lab that can test blood of the chimpanzee population in the park. I'd like you to look at how light that footprint is. There's not even a road to bring in this testing station. If you look at the temperature footprint, you see that it's actually, even though the equipment generates heat, it's actually cooler on the ground. And this is how they get it in there. I mean, I just talk about creative. So you've got the high-tech equipment coming in on flat-packed in on a boat. I mean, this is not just something you made up in studio or in an office in New York. You have to figure out how to get it there. Here's another amazing example. This really is industrial design, but it goes across all design disciplines. So jaundice is a problem, a major problem. 60% of newborns have jaundice, 6 to 10% of infant deaths are from jaundice, and 5.7 million are untreated in Asia. But the cure for jaundice is very simple. It's a blue light. You put the baby under a blue light, it cures jaundice. Okay, why is this continuing to happen? The other thing about public interest design that is so important is having the people involved in using the product and the end users as part of the solution. So Design That Matters went into the hospital. They didn't do this from their design office. They went into the hospital to find out why this was still happening. And they found out there are two very human reasons this is happening. The baby's in the intensive care unit. The mother goes in, gets the baby, takes the baby back to her bed to nurse the baby. I mean, what's more natural than a mother nursing a baby? Unfortunately, the mother's also removing that baby from the treatment. The other thing that was happening is people were putting blankets over the babies, another natural thing to do. You see a baby in a diaper, and you put a blanket over the baby. Well, that also blocked the blue light. So only by going in and observing those two phenomenon did they come up with this solution. And what they say about this photo, they found the smallest nurse in the whole hospital to make sure she could carry a baby and this unit. So basically now the mother picks up the baby and takes the whole unit back to the bed so she can nurse, put the baby in. The other thing is there's light from below as well. So people put a blanket over. You can't stop people from doing that apparently, but the baby's still going to get the blue light. So that sort of partnership and respect for the expertise of the users is really critical to public interest design. So one of the problems with that 10 years of work is that they're individual practitioners and individual projects. Very creative, people out there like myself sort of making this stuff up. No training in this in school, right? I mean, my design, yes. And I think we all feel design is our top skill set. And that's what we all love to do. So this is not about being something else than a designer. This is about the opportunity to do design in some really meaningful ways, at least for me. But the problem is individual people go away. We've already lost Sambo, one of the great leaders. Individual projects go away. We don't want this to go away. So how do we make public interest design systemic and not just a movement or a blip, right? We're all familiar with blips and things going away in architecture. So one of the most effective ways to do that is to see this as a profession. So when we applied to the American Institute of Architects for this prize, $100,000, to research the best practices going on in architecture. Now, one thing I'll say about this, when we were interviewing for this award, one of the fellows of the AIA said to David Perks, "You guys are going to do this anyway, you just want the money." And David said, "It's not about the money, it's about the prize. It's about the recognition from the AIA that this work is part of the profession and should be recognized as part of the profession." And I really think this is an important moment. Obviously, architects have been helping the public out since we ever were architects. But there are some different things now about it. I can tell you that I've always been the alternative career guy on the panel. But I really think that the heart of the profession is embracing this work now, and the heart of the profession and the AIA can do major things to make this into a systemic, permanent change. So when I say it's a field, I'm not actually talking about a separate field, just the same way green design is sort of a part of architecture now. This is also part of architecture, but it's a very specific type of practice. So here's some of the interesting statistics from our, I think they're interesting anyway, from our research. Looking at the impact of the economy, 20% know architects who have left the field because of dissatisfaction with how it serves local communities. 90% think it's possible to create designs of the highest quality while practicing public interest design. That's phenomenal. That was not always true. When I was at Yale, I was told you can either serve communities or do good design. You can't do both. I was literally told that. That's no longer true. And that's part of the evidence that we saw from all those books and exhibits. 56% are more likely to consider career options outside the traditional practice of architecture since the economic downturn. Now this one's really important. Why do people go into architecture? The #1 reason was putting creative abilities to practical use. The #2 reason was improving quality of life in communities. I would like to propose that those two are not exclusive. And if you put your practical creative abilities to practical use to improve quality of life in communities, that's a good definition of public interest design. And so if you take the top 2 reasons why people go into architecture, that's public interest design. So there are a lot of people who want to do this work. What's really fascinating also, if you look at the second column, you see 95. 95 out of 380, I'm sorry, this is a survey of 383 members of the AIA. And it's a scientific survey, and it represents all 80,000 members. So it is it's an accurate sampling. But 95 out of 83 members surveyed said they were doing public interest design paid full-time, as I am. How are they doing it? What are they doing? These are the things we don't know. These are the things we need to know and share so that other people can have a profession in public interest design. One of the things we found, we asked, what are the obstacles to doing public interest design? And most people said education. And anybody who gets this during their school is unbelievably lucky. I did not get one word of discussion of this through my undergraduate or graduate. Not one single word. So anybody, I mean, anybody who's even thinking about this, you're way ahead of where I was. So, but here are some of the specific learning objectives that people said they would like to have to be able to practice public interest design. So maximizing a project's positive impact on a community. Understanding financial strategies to practice public interest design. Measuring the social, economic, and environmental impact of a project on a community. Learning a step-by-step process of working with a community on a project. We've already talked a little bit about how to maximize a project's positive impact on a community by layering issues, by addressing multiple issues that come from the community, and I'm going to show examples of that. You know, I mentioned my own experience with the financial strategies. Obviously, that's really the biggest challenge. The next two we're still going to talk about a little bit tonight. Basically what we found is anything we asked, any learning objective we asked about, people said they wanted it. So the pink dots are that they would value highly learning these learning objectives. So basically this just kind of shows there's a lot of education that's not happening now in our architecture schools to practice public interest design. Now here's probably the most important finding of the whole survey. I'll read it. Sorry to read my slides, but this one is important. 77% believe that this statement is a valuable mission for the practice of public interest design. Every person should be able to live in a socially, economically, and environmentally healthy community. That may seem like obvious, and you know, it may be like mom and apple pie. Who could argue with that? But to me, it's very important to have a clear statement that we can say to the public, say, this is what public interest design means. We did not have that before this. Let me go over these principles, because to me, it was 20 years before these principles were stated clearly, which it seems ridiculous, but we all kind of had a general idea of what we were trying to do, but these principles to me are the first time they were really down on paper. So advocate with those who have a limited voice in public life. Build structures for inclusion that engage stakeholders and allow communities to make decisions. Promote social equality through discourse that reflects a range of values and social identities. Generate ideas that grow from place and build local capacity. Designed to help conserve resources and minimize waste. So this is sort of our communique to the public now. This, and I'd like to mention that it only has the word design in here one time. This is something that we feel we believe in, that not just us, but also licensed architects or AIA members also agree as a mission and principles. And so this is kind of a defining moment for me and the people that have been doing this in many ways. We haven't had this clarity before. So that's what we're using as our mission statement for public interest design. Now I'd like to be, I know we have a panel, so I'm going to sort of throw a little controversy into this, maybe. One of the questions we asked, 58% of respondents believe that were a field of public interest design to exist, there could be an ethical violation resulting in the removal of a professional from the field. That sounds like a really boring question, but it's really important because what we've had so far is people sort of out there, you know, doing it on their own, making up their own standards, their own ethics. Should we keep doing that? I mean, we've had 10 good years, right? Is there a problem with continuing to do that? So let me do a little survey, if I could. How many of you feel that the course we're on now, the sort of trajectory of independent designers sort of doing their own thing, sort of entrepreneurially out there, no sort of collective action, should continue? Or should there start to be professional standards that define the practice of public interest design? So if you like the first choice, raise your hand. I tried to make that as attractive as possible. I'm tempted to raise my hand too, but okay, fair enough. So I'm going to assume that the rest of you feel there should be professional standards. So I don't want to get too bogged down in this, but I do want to point out a couple of other professions at this same moment, okay? Let's take journalism, for example. This is a book written in 1935 by Margaret Bourke-White and Erskine Caldwell. And they went into the South and took pictures of sharecroppers and poor rural Southerners. And so they take a photo like this and they put a caption below it, okay? So here's one. He says, "We've got a first-class God." Here's another one. This woman is holding babies. She says, "I got more children now than I know what to do with, but they keep coming along like watermelons in the summertime." All right. Now, based on our ethics of journalism, you would assume that that woman said that. She didn't say that. Erskine Caldwell made that up. All right, that makes me really angry. I don't know about you. I feel that's a violation of her. When he was asked by the Paris Review why he did that, he said, "I don't believe there's any difference between fact and fiction." Well, you know, Erskine Caldwell can have his own personal ethics, but if we had people like that practicing journalism, journalism would not be a successful public service, right? So journalism is self-policing. Journalism, if you violate ethical standards, they'll retract your story, and you'll lose all professional credibility. So that's one example. Here's an even more sort of horrible one. This is the Tuskegee experiment. So this was a clinical study conducted between 1932 and 1972 in Tuskegee, Alabama by the U.S. Public Health Service to study the natural progression of untreated syphilis in poor rural black men who thought they were receiving free health care from the U.S. government. The Public Health Service, working with Tuskegee Institute, began the study in 1932. Investigators enrolled in the study a total of 600 impoverished African-American sharecroppers from Macon County, Alabama, 399 who had previously contracted syphilis before the study began, and 201 without the disease. For participating in the study, the men were given free medical care, meals, and free burial insurance. They were never told they had syphilis, nor were they ever treated for it. They were told they had bad blood, a local term used to describe several illnesses, including syphilis, anemia, and fatigue. By 1947, penicillin had become the standard treatment for syphilis. Tuskegee scientists continued to study without treating any participants and withholding penicillin and information about it from the patients. In addition, scientists prevented participants from accessing syphilis treatment programs available to others in the area. The study continued under numerous U.S. Public Health Service supervisors until 1972, when a leak to the press eventually resulted in its termination. The victims of the study included numerous men who died of syphilis, wives who contracted the disease, and children born with congenital syphilis. So this is public health before public health had a standard of professional practice. This is the U.S. government. This isn't some random group of doctors. So obviously, public health has come a long way. They now have transparency and accountability and internal reviews to prevent this. And for public health, these doctors actually thought they were serving a public good. That was their opinion. The last director of this went to his grave, never admitted he had done anything wrong. He thought this was for the public good. So my point here is that we can't, if the term is public interest, you have to protect and make sure that it is in the public interest. So my point here is that we do need professional standards if we are going to be trusted and valued by the 98%. So let me take this to architecture. Some of you may know the show that was in MoMA recently called Foreclosed. They pretty quickly said, well, we're not actually talking about foreclosed, that's bankers. Like, well, you called it foreclosed and you could have talked to bankers, but here's one of the projects. This is for Orange, New Jersey. Now, I don't know that much about real estate development, but I have a feeling that if your problem is you've got mortgages that are underwater, the last thing you need is to flood the neighborhood with more housing. So you all might know about that in Detroit, but I don't think what you need in this situation is a lot more housing. Furthermore, if you're living in this house, is that something you really want to look out and see that in your street? They actually interviewed the mayor of Orange, New Jersey about the design. He said, well, he hadn't seen it. The designers didn't talk to him about it, but CNN did. And he said, well, I'm not sure about this, but we're not willing to give up our streets in the near future. So, I mean, let's just talk about fire and police protection and garbage, getting garbage cans, getting your garbage picked up. So that was a very unfortunate show, in my opinion. I mean, that was a great opportunity. Can you imagine if people who were facing an underwater mortgage said, hey, we got to go to MoMA. There's this great show there. It's going to give us some great ideas about how to get out of our situation. It would have been a blockbuster at MoMA. But unfortunately, I mean, you can go or not. I just think it was a missed opportunity. No harm done, I guess. Whoops. Here's one, but there is potential harm to be done. After the tsunami in Japan, I was listening to CNN, and Cameron Sinclair was on there, and he said, this was 3 days after the tsunami, he said, well, I went to the Open Architecture Network, and I put in tsunami response, and I got 5 solutions. This is on CNN. So I went to Open Architecture Network, and this is one of the proposals on there being presented to the public as a solution. Now, what this is a box that floats. Now, you climb in here. It's for 20 people. You shut the top, and I don't know what happens. I mean, the wave comes, you either get smashed into a building or you get carried out to the Pacific. I mean, there's still stuff washing ashore in Oregon right now from Japan. There's no bathroom in there. I'm not sure how they get air in there since it's meant to be watertight. On the Open Architecture Networks, this says this is a solution for 150,000 people. Thank God 150,000 people never got in these things. In other words, we have to be responsible. It's fine to make this up in your office using SketchUp, but to put it out to the public and say this is a conceivable solution is incredibly irresponsible, and it could have been a Tuskegee moment. We've got to be much more careful if our momentum and this wonderful growth that we're seeing is going to continue. So that leads me to my last. I want to share with you one sort of standard. It's not the only standard. It's called SEED. It stands for Social, Economic, Environmental Design. And it was in response to LEAD. A lot of us who work in social and economic justice were kind of frustrated by LEAD. It says there's really only one issue in the world. We'll ignore the other issues. We kind of believe that each community has their own set of priorities. And if you're a public designer, you should be willing to address those and not reject some and promote others. So I already read this to you. I'm not going to read it again, but the core mission and principles of SEED are exactly the same that 77% and 75% of the AIA members agreed to. It's a network. It's sort of a way of taking collective action. There are 1,445 members. It's free to join. I would welcome you all joining. You'll get sort of updates on what's happening in the field. It's seednetwork.org. It's also an online tool that walks you step by step through a public interest design project that we have come up with based on best practices. See, it's quickly growing. We had 568 members, now we have 1,445. But you can submit a project. It is free to submit a project. There are many different reasons you might want to submit a project. If you've never done public interest design before, you'll actually get feedback from people who have done public interest design. So I already discussed why a triple bottom line is because each community has a different set of issues. Social, economic, and environmental covers all the issues. So basically, here's the 9 steps we feel that any public interest design project should take. Who is the applicant? Who is the community? What is the project? What are the issues, challenges, and goals to be addressed? How is the community participating? Think back to that nurse in the hospital. How do you know that this is, first of all, the issue they prioritize, but secondly, how are they involved in the solution? A benchmark just means how do you know that you're on the right track? You don't want a Hail Mary pass where you complete the project and you find out that it had nothing to do with the goal or the issue. So there are ways of setting benchmarks along the way. What is the program? What is going to happen in the design product afterwards, and how is that going to address the challenge? And how are you going to measure success? Measuring success seems like a pain, but it's where we really start to have evidence and where we really start to convince the public that this is real and that we have proof. And then, of course, the results. So this is sort of our checklist of all the issues. We want to keep growing the issues. We want this list to continue to grow, but this is part of the process. I'm not going to go through it, but here's one of the things I want to point out to you. See the yellow boxes? That's for reviewer feedback. So you fill out part 1, you submit it, and then you have 2 people like myself who review it and give you feedback. Here's one of the other reviewers, Jamie Blosser. People who have done this for years. We're doing it voluntarily because we want to help people understand how to do public interest design. So you go through, you say, what are the social issues being addressed? What are the economic issues? What are the environmental issues? You can say we're doing LEED. That's great. We'll accept that. But there are other ways you can address the environment besides LEED. One of the great things about it is people in the community can log on and see what's happening in the project. So it becomes like an online, kind of real-time public meeting. Some people don't want to go to a public meeting. So this allows, you can say who can see the project. You can put in entire zip codes if you want to have access to the project. And you can have certain people also be inputting information. You can get certified if that's something of value to you. It is of value to a lot of people who use public funding. If you're applying for public funding, you can say, we have this third party who's going to certify that the public was involved in setting the goals and was involved in the process. And believe me, people who give out public funding value that. So here's sort of the results. I don't know if you can read that, but here's what it looks like after you've done a project. This is what we give to the mayor. This is what we give to the public. Here's the social, economic, and environmental impact of this project. Does anybody know this project, Batara Hospital by Michael Murphy in Mass? Okay, just one person. It's an amazing story. This is Exhibit A of public interest design. Michael Murphy graduated from Harvard a year and a half ago. But when he was a first-year graduate student there, he went to hear a lecture by Paul Farmer. Paul Farmer is a doctor, founder of Partners in Health. Michael went up to him after the lecture and said, I'd like to work for your architect. Paul Farmer said, I don't use architects. Why would I use an architect? I taught my secretary how to do AutoCAD, and I drew the last hospital on a napkin. Here's a guy building hospitals all over the world. Michael said, well, can I volunteer to do your next hospital? And Paul Farmer said, what the hell, right? So Michael had never built anything before. He's a first-year grad student. All he's got to do is better than a napkin sketch by a doctor, okay? All right, it might be a little intimidating. You haven't done a hospital, but you can do better than the doctor and the napkin, right? So Michael was brave enough to take this on. So he did this hospital serves 400,000 people in a region in Rwanda. The Rwandan government's replacing the military bases with hospitals. What Michael found out right away, looking at the hospitals that Paul Farmer had designed, is that people were going there and getting communicable diseases. They were going there and coming out of there with a disease they didn't have. Because Paul Farmer's not a designer. He doesn't understand the basics. So Michael, simply by having a rate of air exchange, people were getting infected in the corridors, so he moved all the corridors outside. So this hospital is going to directly reduce the spread of communicable diseases. Not indirectly, directly. Do you know what Paul Farmer thinks of Michael Murphy now? He is hiring Michael Murphy for every hospital he does. Michael Murphy has an office now of 33 paid people. All right? So this is Public Interest Design Exhibit A, where there was no architect before, no value placed on an architect. Michael did have to do the first one free to prove the value. Now we've got all this proof, not just about reducing disease. He's actually doing the study now to show that it's reducing diseases. We don't have that result yet. But he also hired local laborers, provided 1,000 jobs to the local people. Do you know what the alternative is? Hiring a Chinese multinational corporation, comes in with Chinese workers, they build this, and then they leave. So Michael, thinking as a seed designer, hired the local people. They did amazing jobs. If you see the stonework on this, I don't have it, you're going to think Scarpa. I mean, it is just beautiful work, okay? So, big D stuff, really beautiful design, but also quantifies the results. Michael's project's not certified yet. This project was certified. I can tell you that Phil Shostak, who did this project, uses that certification in all his interviews for performing arts centers. Really an amazing project, but things like hiring at-risk youth during construction. 44% of construction workers were Durham residents. This project was completed before it was certified, and they weren't getting any credit for any of this stuff. We should get credit for construction jobs when our projects hire people. That's important. That's never even mentioned. So then these become case studies, and I'm going to show you, this is the last project. What would you think if somebody told you, I have a project that's going to address community revitalization, housing, unemployment, health, energy efficiency, crime, and historic preservation? This was an application we got for our SEED Awards program. We give out SEED Awards now. I took out my bull flag and threw that down. I said, there's no way this project is going to do that. Then I looked at the floor plan, saw it all in there. Police substation, clinic with the local hospital, computer training lab. Then I looked at the partners, BNIM, Firm of the Year, Make It Right Foundation, Brad Pitt's deal. But not just them, but all the other partners, the police, the hospital, all the other partners that they brought in that you need to address this. And of course, primarily the community. Now, I want to get to that, so here's their design. The community were the ones that said what they needed, and this is actually their own sort of seed chart of issues that the project addresses. So it actually goes well beyond that list. And here's the program, and you can see actually everything addressed in here. Community spaces provide flexible space for job training, entrepreneurship programs, computer literacy. Amazing project. So again, this addresses the heart of public interest design, which is how to have an impact. How can we do much, much more with much, much less? So in conclusion, the concept of public interest design, of expanding all the design professions, is to move from our current limited role and realize our greater potential. We need to change our vision of ourselves first, in the goals we set for ourselves. Then we can change the public perception of what we can contribute to the greater common good. As you have seen, this is already happening. The collective consciousness of design is changing. This shift gives us an opportunity to do some good work. and to make a permanent change in our collective futures, even to create a new field of practice. The massive shift we need is not going to happen by supernatural forces. It will only happen by many of us becoming activists, by the design community becoming advocates for the human community. Our potential is waiting to be realized. The need is undeniable. The only thing stopping us is us. Thank you.
What we could do right now, as Beaver is uploading the file, we can entertain a few questions about the presentation you just saw.
That survey that you
Yes.
from
Yes.
respondents, how many members of the AIA are there?
80,000.
How many?
80,000.
So why such a low number?
Okay, it was a question about surveying 383 people as a representative sample of 80,000. Fortunately, I was at Harvard when I did this, and I worked with the Institute for Quantitative Social Science. And obviously, when you do a survey, there are ways of knowing whether you're, and actually the names were given to us by the AIA, who does surveys all the time. So that's a pretty typical number for a survey done by the AIA of their membership. The questions also, though, have to be sort of asked in a non-biased way, and that's what I did with the Institute for Quantitative Social Science. So I can be pretty confident between the AIA surveying social scientists and then the Harvard ones that when I say this is representative, it's representative. I don't know much about social science, but these people do. It was a wonderful opportunity because otherwise you'd never know. You'd never be able to know that this was really representative. So, and we had, I mean, I think it went beyond representative. We had every state represented, which you don't necessarily know you're going to have. We had every age, like every single year of licensure for about 60 years. So it was a great spread. But it's only AIA members. I mean, that's the other side. It's you know, that's probably the problem, is that it's not all architects, it's not all designers. I wish we had the ability to do that.
Any other question?
I have a question about, going back to your presentation, about the difference, you sort of skipped by it. I'm interested in the differences between the transient housing and the family-oriented housing, because it's sort of my sense that you could do things for transient housing.
Yes.
That would help people feel good.
Yes.
By providing areas where they can put pictures of their families and things like that. And then the family-oriented housing would be a little more group-oriented.
Well, yeah. So the one with the gable was right after 1986 Immigration Reform Act. And that was a moment when undocumented workers became documented and they could bring their families. So you had a crisis where all these families were in the migrant stream. So we designed that unit for either a family. Now it was only 2 bedrooms, so all the children, both sexes, would be together, or single guys. Okay, we found 2 things. Farmers are not going to house people who aren't working. So actually no families ended up in that unit. Well, they're taking a bed space for a worker. And that's when we also found out that what the families really want is to get out of the migrant stream. So Rural Opportunities has job training, and they were providing job training to anybody who wanted to leave the stream to get into either food processing or construction. And then their income would go to about $14,000 a year. And there's a rural development single-family program, 502, where if you make $14,000 a year and you have a job, pay 1% interest, you can get a $85,000 home. So we also did that. So I didn't talk about that. I actually cut it out earlier today. So because of the resources in that hallway, you know, I know who was getting job training. I could talk to them about single-family home ownership. And we custom designed those houses for those families.
It's interesting because the way you talked about your career, which was I built the thing that I built my career upon, ends up being the same thing that you encountered, where users go through the sort of same stages.
Did you have a question, ma'am?
Professor Boudreau?
I would defer to a student. There was one wanting to ask a question. There seems to be one in the room. Is that a student?
How would one get started in this technical area?
So I'll give you, let me tell you this story. I mean, there's a young guy named Joe Junius in Chicago. He's worked in an architecture office for 5 years designing kitchens for restaurants. He applied to David Perks to be a fellow with David. David said, "You don't need me. You've got this amazing skill. I'm sure there are a lot of nonprofits, food kitchens that would love to have your services. Why don't you go serve them?" So I talked to Joe and I said, "Why don't you come up with an RFP that clients can approach you, apply to you for a job?" So he wrote an RFP and it sounded like, "I'm an out-of-work architect." And so I said, "No, that's not going to work." So I said, "Really what you need is you need to emphasize your idealism about this, and you need a sort of institutional platform." So I said, "Why don't you start a nonprofit?" So Joe Junius is starting a nonprofit. It's called Get Fed. Fed is Food Empowerment and Design. And he's going to go out with an RFP for clients. And what the RFP says, I will do $5,000 worth of design for you up front. But if you get the job, then I get the job, okay? So that's just one example where people have assets that they can convert. They can kind of wheel and deal to a clientele that needs them, a public service clientele. So basically the answer is partnering, okay? That's the number one answer. You need to find partners who have the skill set, well, let me mention one other thing. The SEED evaluator is a grant application, literally. It's like the best grant app I ever wrote, okay? So grants are a great way, just like I talked about. You can sort of propose writing a grant with a nonprofit. So I think, you know, for me it was pick an issue that I'm passionate about, and obviously I'm passionate about it. I didn't think I'd be doing it for 22 years, but here I am. And so I think just because there's a lot of times where it is tough and you need to do it because you're passionate about it, but this is about making a living. So I think Joe's example is good. I mean, we need to be the ones making the proposals, not just applying, right? I mean, I don't enter competitions because I don't like the odds. I say, I make up a competition and I enter it and I win. You know, it's like, I mean, that's sort of what Joe's doing, right? He's going to be the person who gets that job. So that's sort of a couple of ideas. But you've got to be out there proposing, you know, you've got to be the one sort of making it happen.
Okay, at this time, I'd like to take a few minutes so that we can introduce our two panelists. To save time, I'm going to ask each panelist to spend maybe a couple of minutes to present their work and projects they have done. So let's start with Gina Richard.
Hi. Oops. Yeah, right. So in less than 5 minutes, I'm just going to give you a quick overview of what it is I do, and how I started doing it, and why, I guess. But really, I think it's mostly in terms of the panel discussion so that you guys have a reference point for what it is we're talking about, and we can have a dialogue. So Design 99 is my studio practice, and it's a partnership with my husband, Mitch Cope, whose background is in art, fine art, studio art. He's a painter. And I have the architecture degrees. Although I'm not licensed, I'm not a member of the AIA, so I'm in that kind of weird limbo, and maybe we can talk about that a little bit more, about why I live in that realm. But really, Design 99 developed because I was working an office job. I had been for years before I went to grad school, and then I moved to Michigan to go to grad school, and when I graduated, I started working an office job again, and mostly doing corporate interiors, and living in the city of Detroit, and then working for a large international firm doing corporate interiors was this total disconnect in my everyday life. And you know, I had this really great desire to have more of an impact on my immediate community. If you go to our neighborhood, the neighborhood where we live and have for 7 years, there are 1,000,001 design issues that can and should be addressed. And there's nothing wrong with the firm I was working for. It's a great firm, but it doesn't address or even begin to discuss any of the issues that are at hand, you know, where I lived. So sort of like in my own backyard. So we were trying to figure out how do you start your own practice with no clients? And knowing Bryan's essay in the book, Good Deeds, Good Design, but especially that essay about the 98%, it was a huge impact on sort of our decision, or my decision, to create some kind of a design practice that talked about that 98%, or at least attempted to find those people of the 98% who were interested in having a dialogue with a designer and maybe just didn't know how to access one. A lot of people, actually, I found, saw the value in it, but didn't think they could afford it, which made me frustrated. I thought that if my friends and neighbors and family and relatives don't think that I can be of service to them, then what am I doing? So the Design 99 name is a little tongue-in-cheek. It's partly addressing this percentage of the population that seems really inaccessible, both to us and from their point of view. But it also, our first storefront space was in Hamtramck, and the main drag in Hamtramck is a retail strip with a lot of dollar stores, so we were also sort of like the five and dime dollar store approach to architecture and design. And retail, we thought, was a really great way to present ourselves to the public, because the public is really comfortable with retail. Everyone consumes stuff in our society for the most part, so we thought, well, we'll just make design a consumer good or put it in that, that same language of a shop. So, and we had gallery shows in the space, we had events in the space, we sold objects and work by artists and designers, and then we had the counter, and we started marketing these design services. So we had 2 specials. One was we had like an introductory rate of 99 cents a minute, so you kind of knew coming in, what we would charge you, and 99 cents a minute is kind of one of those catchy, comfortable numbers, I guess. People are comfortable, like cell phones and I don't know what other services are charged by the minute. It seemed okay, like it seemed graspable. And the other thing is we offered these $99 house calls. And so for $99, you get like a one-time visit from us. We'd come to your house, we'd talk to you about whatever design issue you wanted to talk to us about. We'd give you kind of a quick scheme. This was actually for a contractor friend who renovates houses in Hamtramck and then rents them out as rental properties. And he uses the cheap 4x4 tiles. And so we said, well, can we be really playful with your bathroom and kitchen designs? And we'll use the cheap tiles, but we'll think of them as pixels, and we'll do sort of the fun, weird, custom pattern for your bathroom. And so, a $99 job is only going to get you so far when you're paying rent and trying to live off of something like this. But it worked. Steve continues to hire us for jobs, and so when the round of HUD housing projects for Hamtramck came through with a $250,000 budget, he hired us to work on that job also. So the whole idea was about, its core was about relationship building. Like, how do you develop relationships with people who wouldn't normally have a relationship with a designer? So it was like sort of this weirdly successful thing, and actually, like, we weirdly got a lot of press attention for it. And I think in part because people in the Detroit area are really hungry for this sort of thing. And I think there is a need and a demand, and it's figuring out kind of an entry point for it. But the thing that really took off for us was actually working in our own neighborhood, and what Bryan was just saying about creating your own projects for yourself. Most of our projects the past 3 years have been self-initiated projects. We usually go out and find the funding for them, and then we pay ourselves out of funding. And then we've also been lucky enough to find funding or supporters or backers and then we can hire other people to work for us as well. So yeah, we kind of created our own economy for ourselves. So this is our neighborhood. It's north of Hamtramck. It's in Detroit proper, but it's a funny little neighborhood, mostly immigrant-based, but this just kind of gives you the character of the place. And the striped house there on the left is the powerhouse. And the powerhouse is it was our first project house. We bought it for very little, and that kind of gave us this luxury of being able to experiment with it and play with off-the-grid technologies and figure out how to transform this house into a community arts space or a hub for visiting artists and international and national artists, and try to create a residency program around it. It's kind of like our test site in the neighborhood. And again, sort of keeping it's still very much under construction. We're in process. But the idea is to keep it in the language of the neighborhood, but then have unexpected sort of capacity around it. So this is like the former attic space transformed into a very well-lit bedroom and private space for a visiting artist, but it's also the reason we re-engineered the roof and went through this whole construction with a glass wall was so that it's also the main heating component for the house. So it's a passive solar heated house. It's off the grid because it had been vandalized, but we kept it off the grid in terms of electric and heat, sort of as a statement about what you can do with the conditions you're given. And we like to kind of invert those things, like if something can be seen or is a found negative, how can you make it a positive? For example, we had worked on a public art project in the Brightmoor neighborhood, and it's just the whole idea of creating an unexpected space in this neighborhood. It was an abandoned garage. Now it's sort of an event space for the church around the street that owns the property. But it also acts as a landmark in a neighborhood where there really aren't any landmarks, and a little surprise when you turn the corner off of Fenkel. So it's called the part of a project called the Talking Fence and Illuminated Garage. And again, we're really into I don't know if you can see it, but the wind turbine and the solar panels on the back. not just for the green statement, but really to talk about sustainability in terms of an economic statement as well. There's no one has to pay a utility bill on that property. And then we do other playful things with museum commissions, but we're kind of always walking this line between playful and pragmatic. So we found ourselves doing larger scale work, and we had this need, but really a desire to buy an earth moving machine. So we bought a Bobcat, and then we turned it into an art project. And so this is the neighborhood machine. It's got a series of trailers that go with it that are solar powered, and there's a garden trailer, there's a collecting trailer. So again, kind of walking that line between practical and totally impractical. The paint scheme, as you saw before, comes from the Powerhouse. And, but it really is sort of this art, sculpture, tool design idea that, that we've been putting to good use lately. Maybe I can just skip through these, but again, we deal with practical issues a lot working in the neighborhood. I mean, most of our work is in a 4-block area. And like I said, it's in our backyard, and knowing the neighborhood, we have crime issues. But you kind of get tired of boarding up houses, like there on the left, you know, just screws and plywood and trying to keep people from breaking into these foreclosed and vacant houses. So we try to be more playful. It's a series we called Sculptural Security Systems. You're using the exact same materials as plywood, screws, and paint. But people can really easily pull the boards off of houses, and people really don't, I'm missing an image, but they really don't know what to do with these structures when they're like in a door or a window. It's instead of doing like a 2D flat space board up, we're doing like a 3-dimensional sculptural board up. They've worked really well. This one is actually between houses because we had some traffic problems in that alley. But again, practical, playful. We're addressing neighborhood design issues, but we're trying to be a little less mundane than, you know, what's necessary. So all of those things so far are kind of talk about our studio practice. Like, that's our studio practice. And we very quickly realized that working at the scale of a neighborhood that we need other people to be involved to make an impact. And so we started a nonprofit, Powerhouse Productions, and the primary goal of Powerhouse Productions is to facilitate the work of other artists and designers, but to work in the same locale. So this is a theater group, the Hinterlands Ensemble, and they were using the Powerhouse for a performance this summer with 150 visitors from around the country who were in Detroit for a theater ensemble conference. And we sort of gave them an introduction to the neighborhood. Artists using empty houses as a portrait studio. This was a really great project, partly because it was early on and it was a way for the neighborhood to start to see what it is that we were doing and have a conversation about what we were doing, but also because Corinne Vermeulen took portraits of a lot of people in our neighborhood, and this was, I guess, 5 years ago now. Now we have this amazing cross-section of very sort of formal, beautiful portraits of people that wouldn't normally sit for a portrait. So that was a nice project. Fire-damaged abandoned houses that sort of became these weird, large-scale architectural collages. But then also have been used by the same theater group for performance spaces. So we actually had that whole audience of 150 people in the backyard watching like the house as theater. Swoon is an artist that was in town for part of a project, and again, using sort of unexpected spaces or spaces, overlooked spaces in unexpected ways. And one of the things we say about our neighborhood a lot is that we sort of suffer from an abundance of housing. Right, we don't need new housing built when we have a glut of it, and what we're really trying to do is get other people to help us come up with a whole array of ideas for what else can you do with these single-family houses or two-family houses. So this one artist from California sort of collaged and bric-a-braced the house inside and out. She actually became so attached to the project in the city that she bought the house from us. The nonprofit owned the house, and now she owns it. And she's actually set up this kind of home base where she travels a lot, but it's her home base, and has been attracting other artists, friends, and colleagues to join in. And we've been helping them secure vacant properties and buy them at the tax auctions and things like that. So raising the population of the neighborhood a little bit, one house at a time. This was part of the same project, which was all kind of funded by Juxtapose magazine. It's actually the reason we became a nonprofit, because they wanted to make this large donation, and we said okay. But this project, Sound House, started as a painting. Richard Coleman and Retna did these really beautiful paintings on the inside of this house, fairly unexpected from the outside. And then a few months later, this sound artist, John Brummett, came through, and he kind of was looking at these paintings and reading them as musical notations. And so now he has a permanent sound installation in the house. We've received 2 or 3 rounds of funding to like kind of continue the project to phase 1 and phase 2, and in the end it'll be a lo-fi recording studio with an archive of visiting musicians and artists who have been there. We kind of keep it on record, and we'd also like to do another round of people who live in the area who are musicians or play music, so they become part of the archive. And then we've kind of become this art tourist destination, so this is one of the spots. And then this year we were lucky enough to be awarded an Art Place grant. It's a nationally funded sort of grant that talks about vibrancy and placemaking, which is super interesting now that sort of the art world and the foundations and the design world are all coming together to talk about this idea of placemaking, which is really what you were talking about. And so, you know, we have a lot of conditions like this in the neighborhood where a family tends their house, and there's actually 3 generations living in this 2-story house on the right, but they're next to an abandoned house that was a county tax foreclosure, and actually at one point was on the city's demolition list. And we have a friend, artist Graham White, who likes to play squash and also dabbles in work at the scale of like the architectural scale, but he's a sculptor primarily. And so his plan is, well, we're in the process of gutting the house to make it a squash court. There's a lot of need for recreation sites in the neighborhood. There are a lot of children that live in the neighborhood, so it's sort of a meeting of recreation and art and sculpture and architecture, as is the Ride It Sculpture Park and the Skate House. And so these are sites along East Davison. One of the houses we own, the other house is currently city-owned, and kind of the same with the lots. It's a mix of what we own and what the city still holds. And this summer we built a skate park on kind of like half of the lots. So this is there's a barbecue at the skate park. So it's been very heavily used, although now that it's getting cold out, a little bit less. And this is what it looked before the graffiti guys came and tagged it. But again, it's really figuring out what to do with space in the neighborhood that serves the community, but still sort of serves our needs and desires as artists and designers. It talks about placemaking, but it's really more than sort of just injecting a cookie-cutter park into the neighborhood. It's really about creating an identity for the neighborhood that both the current residents are proud of, but also as an attractor to people from the outside, and how those 2 or 3 worlds can kind of mix and come together and you know, develop signature spaces in this city. So that's my other slide.
Andy Goldsworthy, an artist that I found some inspiration from, once talked about how he would take the train into his studio every semester, and he found that the landscape outside the train was incredibly vibrant and called to him. And then he'd go into the studio space, and he felt as if he had entered a hospital, that it became this kind of sterilized space. Apparently I need to activate some wizard. I'm going to go ahead and cancel that if that's all right. He found that the space was too controlled, and he said that total control is the death of his work. And I actually found the same to be true in my own work as what I initially called a humanitarian designer, and then as a social responsive designer. Maybe you converted me on that public interest, I don't know, we'll talk about that later. But what I do know is that I agreed with Andy Goldsworthy, that that was the total death of the work. But that's everything I've been trained to do. That I was in my air-conditioned studio with my drafting board or my AutoCAD. Hello, testing, testing. No.
Please use the microphone.
Yeah, I shall do. This is fantastic. I'll drop it at the end. I did feel that oh my word, I felt like it was the death of the work. I felt Andy Goldsworthy had a point, but it was everything I'd been trained to do, that I would sit in my air-conditioned confine at my studio desk with my AutoCAD and dutifully cultivate wisdom somehow, maybe using some internet research or some other folks, occasionally going outside, photograph the site one time, you know, in the winter, freeze, and then come back and figure, I know the site now, and then move on with life. And then surprised when the work that came out of that was incredibly sterilized and really didn't have any resonance in the actual place it would one day call home. And this was troubling to me. And so what I determined is that I needed to do what Andy Goldsworthy did, which he moved out into the landscape, and the landscape became his studio. And so in the same vein, that's where my work happens. And it's not as if I've thrown my sketchbook away. In fact, it's right over there, and I still have a computer with all sorts of wonderful programs on it. But those things are viewed in the context of the work, not the other way around. I established eventually a nonprofit, that's a common theme, I guess, today, called the International Design Clinic. And as I tried to search for inspiration for my newfound kind of pattern of life, I searched into counterculture movements, guerrilla movements, hence the logo, and eventually kind of crafted a hodgepodge that I currently use. One other thing became of this is that I found that the action of architecture actually happened when the thing was in the world, not when it was on your drawing board. That when it was on your drawing board, only you and your best friends could really talk about it. Everyone had been indoctrinated into your language, your lingo, right? There were only so many people could look at the plan. But when it was out in the world, all of a sudden everyone could push against it. It became an object of knowledge, to borrow Claude Lévi-Strauss's term, right? Something that would cultivate knowledge from a wide swath of people. Both engineers and bricoleurs could approach this. So this was our response when we said no, we wouldn't. We were invited to exhibit work in a gallery in Chicago. We said no, we're not going to exhibit work that we've already done, but we'll design a work based on a condition at hand there. And this was an instigatory act. Designed as an instigatory act. It was an urban tent. Completely watertight, scalloped Walmart bags underneath that, made for $0 and 0 cents, using reclaimed water bottles and such. And it would hold the weight of the occupant above the surface of the earth and snap like a shower cap over the hand cart that they would use to put their belongings around. But again, it never would I ever say it was a solution, because I don't believe in the problem-solution dynamic. At least in my world, it oversimplifies the situations I address and overstates my potential impact on them, or at least as I understand it. And so this was one step, and it was an invitation. And to the gallery, we didn't even send this. We sent 350 manuals, and with it an invitation for people who knew more than we did to take one and do better, and a kind of an open source shareware thing. And all of our work assumes that. And it was interesting, this is Interior Design Magazine, how it picked up. And this, for me, symbolized the horrible failure of the work, because we were trying to get around the fetishization of the object, right? We love to do that. We're ocular-centric as a field. We love to talk about beauty and such. And for us, the purpose of the work was actually differently located. But this is where it had the resonance, and websites and other things picked it up. So back to the old drawing board, metaphorically, out in the field. All right. So we continue to install. This is another piece done. It's called Fence Pocket, and it's done with reclaimed tarp, and it's not programmed, actually. It just takes and provides an architecture where the fence deviates away from the sidewalk, creating a thickening of the line between public and private, and this provides a place to occupy that. But the people who program it are the residents of the neighborhood, the people who pass by it. So this neighborhood planted trees in it because they wanted a community garden there, and that landowner said no. But his fence was all ramshackle. So we could cultivate this little area, and they made their own garden there. Other people have made fence pocket trash cans, which isn't glorious but very useful, and fence pocket bench where they sit, where they wanted a seat. This was a little more robust project. It involved a huge pool of labor, including local prison folk and kids from the school. It was meant to address stormwater that was flooding off this, as well as provide flooding off this, and this school was getting charged for that stormwater by the water department, and also to provide a place where the kids could learn outside. But the whole thing was made with stuff from an abandoned lot. And just a simple act of torquing the structure of a chain link fence, which is supposed to be 90 degrees and flat. And actually, all of the angles here are 90 degrees. You just change the plane of rotation, and you get a little more efficient structural system and a little more dynamic kind of envelope. And what's interesting is how everything else kind of contorts once you make that one move. And so everything was just keeping up with that. So you see how the fence kind of launches itself after you do this. But what was interesting about this work is all of this is locally harvested scrap wood. and beneath is locally harvested debris and soil. And it just came from us walking around and seeing someone ripping up a sidewalk, that someone being the city of Philadelphia, and saying, can we have that? And they didn't want to pay 30 bucks to take it to the proper landfill, and they could just take it to us for free, so they gave it to us. And the same thing happened with topsoil. And what was also interesting, in a place like the U.S., where if it's a funeral, graduation, birthday, whatever, what do? You bring a gift. That's how we're programmed, right? Everyone brings a gift. You bring wine if you're invited to a dinner. At least at my house, I hope you do. And what was interesting is as people would give us chunks of wood from their garage, they became vested in this work, just with a chunk of wood. And in this, there's a church that took its door down, like a little red door. We chopped it up. It's a part of this bench, stage sets. And so the quilt actually became a kind of like a gumbo. I've spent some time in Lafayette where people would just throw it in the pot, right? And that's what happened here. And the architecture kind of became an accumulator of people. And what was interesting about that is those people now have offered to tend the garden for this school. The people have now offered to give money to this school to build new ones of these or extend this. And the school board has asked to have versions of this, again, mind you, stuff from an abandoned lot, right, put on other school sites, which is really, I think, interesting. It talks about kind of regenerative value and maybe a forward-looking kind of sustainability. For those of you interested in the room, I'm going to be teaching an Allied studio this spring, and a bit of shameless promotion on that topic. And the other work is working, this is a 3-year project, working with kids who work the streets of La Paz, Bolivia, who can't attend schools because it was designed, well, it was designed by an architect in this kind of $600,000 in the middle of the city, giant, robust facility that too far away from the kids, they can't be a part of it. And so we said, okay, well, if we want the kids to be a part of education, maybe we should switch that order, and the education should be a part of the lives of the kids. So we spent a lot of time getting to know the kids, hanging out with them, doing various projects with them on the street. Nothing that would maybe you point to and look at architecture, but very important for our understanding. And in my mind, architecture can maybe we don't need to be so tied to architecture, meaning bricks and mortar. Maybe architecture can mean more of infrastructure. Maybe that's okay. Lots of other people are, there's an eyelash, thing that calls it architect, right? There's information architects. Everyone's comfortable using the term but us. And I think it's okay to say that architecture can exist at other scales. And so when we started to invent the school or look at the school, our first scale was a postcard and saying what educational value can a postcard hold? And that was actually from the kids because they would use the postcard as a part of advertising for their vending, right, and what they were doing. And so then we said, well, what else do they use? Well, they use these little boxes that they carry around to shine your shoes. So can a school be in a box? Can a school be in a handcart? And can a school be in a vending booth? And this is a vending booth designed to performance art. You can see the drum kit in there made with tape and some other reclaimed stuff. And what was interesting about this is all of this was made out there in the street, not in a closet with AutoCAD, locked away in my air conditioning or our air conditioning. It was made actually with I would just set the call out as I'm doing this summer, as I'll say, the International Design Clinic's going to Bolivia from May 23rd through June 25th. You want to come? Come. And people from all over the U.S. will come. Students, professionals, linguists, right? Not architects. It's linguists, anthropologists, a mix of people. And that dynamic creates, I think, a very lively conversation and a work that's more profound than what we as maybe just architects narrowly defined or architects and designers narrowly defined could come up with on our own. And what was interesting about that is, once again, the work becomes the draw. And I think there's something powerful in that, and I think that's what I appreciate about the work that we've just seen and what I hope we can talk about a little bit in the conversation to come. Thank you.
So before I turn to you for some questions, I do have one quick question that I want to ask to all 3 panelists. So if you panelists come sit at the table. So the question that I want to ask Scott and Gina is this. The work that you presented, let's start with Gina. The work that you presented tonight, do you consider them PID? Number 2, how would you Bryan talked about measuring success, so PID, as part of your presentation. I also curious about how you measure the success of your project if you think it's a PID. So I would ask the same question for Scott. So let's start with Gina.
Sure. I don't. Measurements and metrics are something we're talking about a lot lately because when you get these grants, that's what they're all talking about. And I do think it's important. The trick with a lot of our projects is that none of them are really finished yet. So for us, the easiest one to measure so far would be the skate park because it's up and running. It's not really finished. I can't technically say it's finished. It's not, but it's finished enough so that it's being used. And to us, that's the biggest success is that it's being used because that one is like a public space design. And I mean, people were using it before we'd even finished pouring all the concrete. And the exciting thing for us is that it's sort of being misused. Like someone shot a rap video there a couple months ago, and that was like community acceptance that we wouldn't have even thought to seek out, like musicians using the space. Or when the theater group hosted the conference goers there, that was the finale because it was sort of like a traveling performance through the neighborhood. The finale was there, and there was a marching band that played, and there was a jit dancer that performed, and so all of a sudden the skate park became a stage. And that was programmed we hadn't necessarily envisioned. So that one I guess we could measure, but the others really, the public program components aren't up and running. There's a lot of interest, so it's sort of, I guess there's a level of success because there's interest, so we're striking some kind of a chord with people, but now there's sort of this like expectation to live up to. And then, I don't know, I feel like a lot of what we do doesn't quite fit the bill of public interest design, not because maybe it doesn't fulfill some of that criteria, but a lot of, or so much of what we do is really in the realm of art and sort of a public art that's more about, it's not, like object, like a sculpture in a plaza kind of public art, but it's really public art that's placemaking. So I think maybe we like approach public interest design, but I think if we looked at your criteria, there's probably a lot we fall short of. And I think a lot of it has to do with because we do approach most of the work as studio artists and not as inclusive design, like charrettes or like public engagement at that level. A lot of our public engagement comes with activating an audience, more in talking about art terms and not in terms of talking about public involvement in the design process. So, I mean, we're a little bit of like dictators when it comes to the aesthetic of things. And I think that's because in graduate school, I kind of took a left turn and went more towards studio art and less towards sort of an architectural, I don't know, practice. And when studio artists sort of come with their own idea, and yes, I don't know, maybe we can talk more about that. But.
Scott?
I'm going to break your question down into two parts. In terms of, am I a public interest designer? Is that public interest design? I can't say universally yes or no, and I think part of the hesitancy comes from the fact that I've found that every time I say a term, I immediately question. I don't even believe really in terms like client, owner, and public, because I think it installs a false hierarchy in the design process that I think is at odds with the type of work I try to do. I think that site is a problematic term for me. I prefer to talk about situations because it welcomes event and other more important factors. Site has been polluted with ideas of it being a geography or a physical condition when that really represents such a small piece of what it is that we do. And so I have I would like to say yes, because I like Bryan and I would admire it. And actually, I did put the vending architecture piece, I put it on that SEED website, right? So there's solidarity right there. And I'm going to do the same with Chain Link Green, actually, now that you've had the presentation, because I actually think that matches even more closely now that I understand what's about. The idea of metric, though, I will give you an unequivocal yes, that if we do not measure and understand what we're putting out there into the world, there's no way for us to get better at it. I mean, you have to be able to kind of figure out this, and all of my work, as I said, is meant to be iterative, right? And so when we put the postcards out there, we measured them 8 ways to Sunday, which is really hard because we gave away thousands of those suckers, right? And then we had to interview hundreds of shoe shine boys. And then we saw those little postcards in the shoe shine boxes. And then we said, well, why did you keep that? Because that's like sacred space. That's all they get, right? They get this much room to carry their stuff, and they gave us a piece of that? That's huge, right? So then we explored, what does that mean? And when we did the box, we mapped out every instance of formal and informal market in the city of La Paz. That's a capital city. It's huge. And I paid Lustrabota, I paid kids, like all the grants I all go funding, like they all go to the informal settlements and such. We're paying kids, and they're noting down where the markets are open, where they're closed, what they're selling. Then we use that to find hot spots of potential education hotspots, which we then test with the boxes going through the city in a kind of a randomized distribution over and over and over and over again, so we can determine whether it's the geography, the situation, the time, the topic area being discussed in the box. So we're really rigorous about understanding this, because that then determines where the next scale up. One of the things I always say is that I believe that larger, more profound architecture needs to earn the right to exist. You should start with the simplest and cheapest and easiest way at something, and if you can meet the demands at hand with that, then why in the world are you going above that, right? And for us in the school system, if we could answer all the questions with a postcard that costs less than a penny, why would we spend $5 on a box, right? Or $50 on a hand card, or $100 on a vending booth? And it's understanding school as a network. So I'll give you an unequivocal and passionate yes in terms of measuring and being much, much better. And it's hard sometimes to measure this because you're talking about informality, and that by nature talks about distributed networks that we understand very little about. But that's been my muse of late.
Bryan, I want to hear your quick response to what they said, and then I'm going to turn to our audience.
I absolutely believe in the iterative process, and that does mean that you don't know where you're, if you're really honest about that. It's about discovering the unknown. So it's a conversation, which is iterative, right? It's not, this is what we're going to do. So there's this creative tension between sort of saying, yes, we did what we said we were going to do, which is sort of the validity of a seed project. Say, we're going to address crime in the neighborhood, and yes, we did that. But I absolutely believe in the iterative process as a way of engaging a community and not coming in top down. I think Design 99 is really unique because they are in the community, so they can't really record all the, which is a wonderful way of, but you don't record every conversation you have. So, you know, there's not one, I probably came across like I know everything or something, and let me just say, I want you students to hopefully learn from this and do a better job like starting tomorrow, and I believe you will. I think we all believe you will. We hope you will. So one last thing is that in terms of the, you know, you're saying that I believe we are the form givers, right? I don't turn the pencil over to the community and say, here, you draw what you want. I mean, I'm the, you know, this is where I put all my energy in education, and whatever sort of gifts I have is in that area. So I think we are the form givers, but we also have to, and that's our responsibility, because some people can't be the form givers. We are the hands for people. We are the creative act for people. What I don't believe in is coming in with an idea and just sort of imposing it. So there has to be this conversation, but then we give it our best aesthetic, you know, beautiful, highest quality design. And that's, you know, that's one thing we learn in school. What is high quality design? And that's what we need to deliver. And thank God for that 90% question, because it used to be that our best talent wouldn't go into this field because they felt like they couldn't do their best work.
We have a very anxious audience, actually. They like to ask a lot of questions. So can we get some interesting questions from?
Oh, let me come around 1 second.
Yes. Good evening. In my own research and teaching in this area, one of the things I've come across that's kind of maybe troubling, maybe interesting, and maybe it's a mark that this kind of work is getting more notice. I see a lot of pushback from people who are really steeped in traditional practice. They look at the storefront architecture, the $99 house call, the a la carte menu of services, certainly John Moorfield and the architecture for 5 cents a question, and they say, you're devaluing our profession. And I'd like to know, because you all work with this in different perspectives, what's your answer to the traditional practitioner who says you're taking the value out of what we do?
I mean, I'd say the 98% gives us no value. So, I mean, you know, I'm not competing for those 2%. You guys want to fight for the 2%? Go, have a good time. Charge whatever you want. You know, I'm down here where, you know, so it's, I don't have any pushback. I don't know, I hang in the wrong circles maybe, but I am in bed with the AIA right now. I think if there's pushback, that would be it. So,
No, and the AIA funded several of the projects and published several of the projects, so they get it. And I would actually shoot back at those folks that they're the ones devaluing the field, because what they're doing is competing for the same 2% without expanding the marketplace, and supply and demand would dictate that would then depress the cost, right, associated with what they're giving. Meanwhile, we're trying here to tap into the 98%, which would expand, right, our marketability, which would actually increase, right, the potential salary that we can offer. So I think they're being hypocrites.
well, I would also, there's also one, I'm sorry, you want to?
No, go ahead.
There's one other model that's really fascinating, and Emily Taylor at City Center in Tulane, a lot of these programs are incubating projects, and then they get sent over to the professionals. I mean, this is what Tulane City Center does, and when I talk to you about starting a project, saying I'll do $5,000 up front, listen, nonprofits don't have money to pay an architect for a schematic design to go after a grant. So if you say, pay me $5,000, they're going to say, project's dead. But if you say, I'll give you the schematic, you can get a grant, and then you hire me, that works. So there are plenty of programs out there. Dan Patera in New Orleans, his St. Joseph's project, the students did all the research, and Wayne Troyer came in as a paid architect on the project. So
I think it's a very narrow view. And, you know, yeah, I think that's the nicest way to put it. It's just a very narrow view on the profession and what the options are. And I think that, right, if that's where those people are comfortable, that's fine. I respect that work. But there's so much room for so much more, and there's so much room to diversify the practice and look at new models. And I think any business should be looking at new models in this economy. And so to say it cheapens it is not, I think it doesn't understand what a lot of us are trying to do. I don't only work for $99 or 99 cents a minute, but that was like my marketing strategy. And I worked at corporate firms who did thousands of dollars of work, marketing work, with no return. So if you like break it down in terms of percentages in return, I was actually doing way better than Gensler. But that's not, I think it's sort of a flip remark. And the 5 cent booth, I thought that was an interesting experiment and study, and obviously he's not going to, that's not a sustainable, way to go after jobs, but it's a really amazing way to get it. Do you know how much press he got for that? I mean, more press than I bet a lot of these people, who are critiquing these approaches get on most of their jobs. So it's that whole idea of, well, I don't know, there's no bad press, so let the critics talk, because it just creates dialogue that does go somewhere. So.
And I would add also with the Bolivia project, there was no client initially. There's no owner initially. The work generated clients and owners. And actually what's interesting is that now we're sitting at 3 or 4 people who are kind of all wanting to partner as a part of this work, and they emerge gradually over time. And so the work actually becomes a generator of client rather than the other way around.
This is generating clients. I think that's the...
And it goes back to the whole idea of, that Bryan doesn't enter competitions. It's, because the odds they're terrible odds. But it's also, what do you choose to spend your time and money and energy on? And the fact that if you're creating your own work, that's a totally different model than what someone who's talking about charging 10 or 12% of a construction, but it's just not the model they're thinking of. So a self-initiated project, you're getting nothing up front, but if we get a $250,000 grant out of it, that's a pretty good return. So yeah, it's just different models.
I mean, in my strange world, if there's another architect that I'm competing with, I kind of lose interest in the job, frankly, because I feel less valuable, actually. If they're, you know, I mean, maybe I'll do a better job than them, I guess, but I like to go where there's no architect. That's when I really feel valuable. So that's just my own take on it.
It's also, sorry, it's a really, I mean, the whole value, the whole term value and how you define value is one of the most interesting conversations that I think you could have out of this evening. Just who's defining it and how's it being defined, and what sort of narrow world vision does someone have if they're talking only about a certain monetary value. So.
We have a question from students. Yes. Oh.
I guess I was wondering, what do you believe the next steps are to begin to change the curriculum or architectural pedagogy towards designing towards a 98% instead of the unsustainable 2% of the job market? And I guess what types of things do you think, because the curriculum that most architecture students go through is so focused on achieving like a NCARB your accreditation, and it's a very top-down process, but everything you guys speak of is very bottom-up. So I guess what are like kind of the next steps in spreading these ideas?
I would say you guys already have so many more options than I had going through school. I mean, Sam Mockbee was sort of like the one model, and that the way he was teaching at Auburn was sort of like the one alternative model that I had to look at. And now there are so many other models to look at that, yeah, you're starting from like a much further place than I even had. So I actually think it's okay. But
I think it's building the conversation, right? And I actually believe, and one of the reasons I'm at Lawrence Tech is because I believe the conversation is happening in a fairly robust way. When you start to look at the work of Ed Orlowski and a Constance and a June and an Amy and Jim Stevens and all of these folks that are talking about this nature of work in this place, it's a pretty massive accumulation. Every school I've been a part of, there are one or two kind of flag bearers say, hey, I gotta think about this, right? And here, that's not the case. You have a fairly muscular body around that. And I think it's about enough students taking advantage, enough crazy folks saying, you know, I'm gonna go to Bolivia. I don't know why, I think I just need to go. And then they come back and they start to talk about a new context for design practice, one that's outside the walls of the studio. And that starts to infect other people, and they start to talk about it too. I don't believe don't look for a top-down savior on a white horse, right? Do it on your own.
Yeah, I think that, for one thing, the schools have so many, so much curriculum they have to teach. There's very little room for electives, and I think that's something to look at. But I do think, I mean, I love everything I learned in school. But I wish some of my studios had real, real clients, you know, so I could actually have a conversation. I mean, it's just ridiculous that every program I ever got, it was handed to me. All the way through school, I never learned how to write a program. Mm-hmm. You know what I learned from working for Sambo? Poetry, a lot of poetry happens in what's written here. And if you don't know how to write that, and if you don't know how to go to a community or a person and sit down and find poetry in that person, and then go to that document, you have no way of doing this work. So I do wish that I had learned how to have a conversation with people, with real people. There's certainly lots of books and a lot of things you have that we didn't have, and there are training programs like we have for people that don't have this. Obviously, you have wonderful opportunities and faculty here, conversations here. But it needs to be you need to be a little bit of self-starter. I do want to emphasize what Scott said. There is no, the only wrong step to take is no step. There's no perfect step, but any step, especially when you realize it's an iterative process. You can take a step. In fact, I'll tell you this is when I went to teach with Sambo at the Rural Studio, I never taught before, and I said, Sambo, how do you get these projects like this? He said, we beat the bushes until the good ideas come up, and then we grab them. And that's like a mega iterative process, right? I mean, so don't worry about like taking the perfect, step. You've got to sort of look at 100 wrong steps and then you figure it out.
Any question from this side? Anyone?
Oh, keep them up high.
Okay. Hi, I'm originally from Chicago, and so I went to City College in Chicago, downtown the Loop area, and my studio, we had a real client. The mayor's office came to our school and wanted us to design a sustainable roof. So we did all the drawings and all the schematic design, and we had 3 presentations. And then the dean in charge kind of switched, I guess, positions within the college, and simultaneously our mayor resigned, so there's a new mayor now. So the ball kind of dropped. So I'm wondering, and that was like a year and a half ago, and now I'm here, so I'm wondering if there's a way to revitalize that and who's to blame. And
Can I tell you a story?
Yeah.
So my wife was at UVA. She had a real project with Sambo. Sambo's her studio in Marion, Alabama. They had the mayor come up. They had civil rights leaders come up, be on the jury. It was for a great project. Sambo went to a meeting. He said, what's your issue? They said, unemployment. So did Sambo say, well, that's not architects? He said, why? And he said, because we have undertrained workforce and we have no child care. So the single moms can't work. And he said, well, how about a job training child care center? And they said, yeah. So that was the studio, right? So they did the studio, and I was the guest critic. And didn't start dating my wife then, but I ended up marrying my wife, who was in that studio. She said to me like 6 months after the studio, what happened to that project? And I said, I don't know. Call the mayor up and ask him. She called up the mayor, and she said, do you want to do the project? He said, yeah, I don't know what happened. So she got a Rose Fellowship that paid her $40,000 a year for 3 years to work on the project. She got a $400,000 HUD grant, and the project's built. So don't be looking to other people to take the step. You know the step to take.
Our nonprofit in Bolivia, the main nonprofit that started this project, had the audacity to move from the downtown after we had conducted the research to the informal settlement ringing the city. And of course, fundamentally, I believe that that was a good move given the nature of their work, but all our research was bupkis at that point in time, right? Yeah. And we're talking tens of thousands of dollars of research. And so after I hummed and hawed a while, I started to say, well, wait a minute, maybe there's a way that this can be an advantage. And this is actually what prompted all of those other nonprofits coming into the fray, because I basically put that research up for sale, except I didn't charge them anything. I said, we have this great research, this project resonates, right? Meanwhile, our nonprofit partners has already started to regenerate and craft new versions of the work based on the premise, and so it's evolving now in an informal settlement, which we couldn't anticipate by a user group that knows it far better than we know it. And now when we go back this summer, we're going to have 2 places where we're doing this kind of work. One in the informal settlement ringing the city and the other downtown with 2 completely different sets. And you know what? Now I'm kind of excited at the prospect of this nonprofit we're working with moving somewhere else. Because it will go back, it'll go again, and it'll grow again. So I think sometimes there are hidden opportunities as long as you're not so chained into linear thought patterns where there's a preconceived goal. And if I don't reach that, right, it's a failure. I think oftentimes we miss success for such a focus.
And just let me add, I'm not saying you're doing this, but be careful. We're very guilty of saying, here's my great idea, now it's your headache. And so the reason my wife's project worked is because she said, here's my great idea, I'll do the work to get this done. So figure out if there's an obstacle, and you may have to say, well, I'll write a grant or whatever that obstacle is. You gotta, so I just want to be careful about saying it just will take a phone call to make this happen.
I think it's also understanding the complexity of politics and cities, and also maybe just in terms of making that phone call or sending that packet of information, understanding, are the new mayor's priorities the same as the old mayor's? Maybe they're not. And you push to a certain degree depending on your passion or your belief in the thing, but it's not all lost. I mean, it's what did you learn from that entire experience, and now you're in a new city or a new metropolitan area, and what's this mayor doing, or what does this mayor need?
Such a great point. Yep, absolutely. So You know how many mayors there are out there? I mean, package it up and send it to mayors. I mean, you know, you've got this experience, forget that mayor, go to another mayor. I mean, just like she said, this is what we mean by iterative. It's like taking that good idea, sort of like you cut the bad and you keep the good moving. Whatever, you got to figure out which is which.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I just had a question you were talking about as far as implementing kind of standards of ethics into the field of public interest design. I guess I was curious as to what you think the initial ones or the major ones might be, and like how those vary from the standards of ethics that the field of architecture follows as a whole.
Well, maybe I wasn't clear. The 5 principles of SEED are the ethics that I'm suggesting.
I guess I meant like in addition to what SEED's already throwing out there.
Yeah, I mean, I love the concision of those SEED. The way those were written is the first 200 members of SEED, we did a survey monkey. Everybody could make up any ideal or principle they wanted. We had about 100, and then we voted. 6 got a majority vote, and one person, Katie Swenson, said, you know, one of those is actually more of a mission. So that's how we got them. It was a democratic decision-making. Could have been 100 of them, but I'm very comfortable with those 5. I mean, I think we need a certain, and there was another statistic up there about how many, I think it was 57% of AIA members said that the architectural ethics needed to be strengthened. I think a lot of us feel that. So that's my answer. And you know, those aren't the only ones. I just feel we have a sort of, we have a consensus about those, and we need a consensus in this, and we need the wisdom of all of us. And so then, you know, so that was a bunch of us voting on that, and now we have the AIA voting on that. So there's, you know, you can make up other ones, and there are other ones that are, I'm sure, just as good. But the fact that people have agreed to these, I think, is important.
This is mainly directed at Gina. I've been to the sculpture park many, many times, and I love how it brings out all the kids from the neighborhood, and all of my friends participated in the summer barbecue and everything, and it's inspired us all. I just moved out of Detroit, but they all live in the city, and they are all interested and now inspired to start doing nonprofit things like that, and them, along with myself, are trying to come up with ideas. And what was it about that neighborhood that kind of drew you to the skate park? Because I know just building a bunch of skate parks, all these guys, that's what they all want to do, but it's not really reasonable for all these neighborhoods to just have skate parks around now. So what was it about that neighborhood that inspired the skate park? And what is it about a neighborhood that kind of creates the project?
Well, I think it's true what Bryan said earlier, is we kind of get to cheat because it's where we live. I mean, maybe to go back, what drew us to the neighborhood in the first place is just that we bought like one of the little corner storefront houses. It was just for us sort of the perfect combination of having a workspace and a residence all in one. And honestly, we partly like the neighborhood because it is kind of this transitional place between, like, it's stable but it's unstable. It's you know, there comes a responsibility but also opportunity with those kind of neighborhoods. So there's enough of like stability or structure or population that it's not like lonely or deserted, but there's enough openness or vacancy that that we could test out ideas. So that's kind of how we got to that area in the first place, and that was 7 years ago. And so after having spent, you know, 7 years living in this place, you get to know the kids and the neighbors, their daily patterns, what they like to do, what they already do. I mean, a lot of it has been very informal over that time, and we haven't documented a lot of it, but we know that, like, for example, in the summer, kids ride up and down the sidewalk all day long on their bicycles. We know sometimes they go in the street and that a lot of cars blow through stop signs. So there's like, there's just a lot of play that happens in spaces that aren't designed for play to happen. And so a lot of these sort of art, athletic, recreation spaces come out of that. When we first moved into the neighborhood, there were kids who had taken over a couple of empty lots and put down carpet and set up a volleyball and badminton net just because they wanted something to do. So we do take a lot of cues from our neighbors. And I guess the skate park specifically came out of the fact that, I don't know if you guys know the area, but it's on if you go Davison east, like right off of I-75, it's right as you come up, like Davison's a depressed highway and then it turns into a surface road and it's right there, that's where we are. And that's how we usually come and go from the neighborhood. And eventually you just get tired of coming up out of the highway and just seeing abandoned buildings and vacant lots that were trash dump sites. So, so we had been thinking about that stretch of Davison for quite a while anyway, like the approach to the Conant traffic light. And then you just, then you just start thinking of ideas and thinking of ideas for land use that isn't like another public garden, or another urban garden. There's nothing wrong with urban gardening, we love it, but most of our neighbors have their own private gardens in their backyard. There's not a need or a desire for a public garden necessarily. So that's, again, sort of an informal study, just because we live there, we know. But also really, gardens require a lot of maintenance in terms of sustainability. Again, when we talk about sustainability in our neighborhood, it's not just the green stuff, it's economic sustainability, sort of project sustainability, social sustainability. It's more complex than just the green energy stuff. So we're like, what is something that we could sort of like design and sculpt the landscape? We would like to give some terrain and elevation to these empty lots. Detroit is so flat. I come from Cincinnati, which has lots of hills. I miss hills. But also just kids don't even really have the opportunity to run up and down a hill in the city. There just aren't hills. So all of those things kind of come together. And then, Mitch, my partner, grew up skateboarding. So there's also just like that. But also the fact that a skate park is really durable. It's concrete and it's, other than the graffiti, there aren't so many maintenance issues. So it's sort of balancing practical with playful and a pragmatic response to sort of a sculptural or aesthetic response, and then just figuring out how you can make all that happen in a project. There are other ideas for green spaces in the neighborhood, but frankly, we were also able to really tap into the professional skateboarding community because of our network of people we know and do some crazy fundraising for it. So it's all, relationship building is really huge in design. And I don't know, again, without having clients in school, I don't think relationship building is emphasized enough. And that can mean whatever you want it to mean. Who do you want to have a relationship with? Decide who you want to have a relationship with and then figure it out. I don't know. We also work pretty slow and think long term. So, we started this project, thinking about this project officially 2 years ago, but unofficially probably 5 years ago. So we're not in a rush.
I think this field is a really fascinating area for new expertise and new models. A couple of really quick stories. So at the Rural Studio, these thesis students wanted to do a community project. There was this old bus on the site. We said, oh great, we'll cut the bus up. They want to do something for the children. So they said, we'll cut the bus up, we'll reuse it, it will be a metaphor of rebirth and education. They asked the community about that. They said, that's a terrible idea. Somebody sold drugs in there, there's snakes in there. Everything evil about, rural Alabama was associated. So you do need to ask the question. But for good examples, Hester Street Collaborative in Chinatown, New York City, there's one last piece of open space in Chinatown. Has very little open space. They launched a campaign, and one of the things they did, they put this little felt map of the area on the back of a bicycle and rode it around Chinatown, just to get, and people could play with it. And they'd say, do you want this to be a private athletic facility, which the city was proposing, or do you want this to be public? They won that fight. That is now going to be public space, thanks to Hester Street, and not just the little bike. But do you know that you have the best person in the world at this? Does anybody know how many people participated in Detroit Works in a community visioning process? 170,000 people participated in Detroit Works one way or another, from an online tool that was 40,000 people to a little table they set up with a chair, 170,000 people. I mean, that is unbelievable. That just shows a whole new realm of planning and everything. So I think this is really and they're going to publish all their techniques sometime soon online. So it's really fun. I'll tell one more quick story. So we started, for housing, we started interviewing people in the housing. And finally some guy passed me a note, and I was like, a note? And I realized they couldn't complain about the housing or they could get fired, right? Because growers get sued for bad housing. So then we started interviewing workers at Migrant Health, where they were just sitting there, and we thought, oh, they have free time, they don't mind talking to us. And one of our more sensitive fellows said, they don't know who you are, and they're probably thinking about why they're at the doctor's. Maybe that's not a good idea. So now Sunday afternoons, if we have an idea, we think migrants need this, we rent a booth at a flea market Sunday afternoon, costs like $15, and we do surveys. And we're not social scientists, but I can ask somebody, what are the problems with your bathroom, and get a pretty good idea if our speculative solution is the right course or not. And what we do, and this is really important for the students, because the students are the ones doing this. This is where the students get this experience. The students are interviewing people in Spanish, and once they fill out a survey, we give them either a Coke or a bottle of cold water or a bag of chips. And what the students are learning is that they're helping us. We're not helping them right now. They're helping us, and we're going to give them something in return. So anyway.
That's a really good lesson. Make sure that it's not a one-way process. Like, it's very condescending to think that sort of either like, like you said, you're here with a solution that I'll impose on you, or presenting, it goes so far to just try to be on the same level and make sure that it's somehow a two-way operation, that they're doing as much for you as you're doing for them. It's not, I'm very leery of people who start talking about, I don't know, or start with that sort of do-good mentality, because the do-good mentality in the end is very self-serving, and if it's not a relationship that goes in both directions, then I've found that it usually ends up being unsuccessful. Just human nature.
Maybe I could have one more question. Oh my God. Yes. We could stay all night tonight.
How about two more questions? Two more questions. Here's the mic.
Oh.
We're going to do two more questions.
Okay. Is there a route you guys recommend taking as far as occupation-wise? You guys, I believe you guys worked at larger firms before you went PID. Is that something that helped you? Oh, I don't like this. I would like to go more. Or could you do it? If you would, could you do it out of school? What?
My first job out of school was AmeriCorps, working for Habitat for Humanity. But Habitat for Humanity has issues with their housing models also. And then I think what I learned by working at firms, I learned a lot of great things by working at firms. I learned sort of different processes. I learned about building code. I learned about, I don't know, like realizing projects in the real world. So in a lot of ways, my office experience was invaluable. And if I didn't have that, I don't know if I'd feel as free or comfortable to sort of, I'm not really reacting against it, but to have gone out after a different model, because I wouldn't understand the profession or the way building and safety departments work. Or you can always learn trial and error, or depending on your personality, you just do it or figure it out. But for me, I was much more comfortable sort of building up that experience in a more traditional workforce, and then having 10 years of knowledge under my belt. Then I can kind of go off and experiment in the ways that I'm more interested or more passionate about.
When I graduated from the University of Cincinnati as an undergraduate, I realized I had been sold a bill of goods, that I had been told about a very narrow piece of the built environment and told that I should propagate it without asking a lot of questions. So I went and immediately got a job doing the exact inverse. I designed amusement parks right out of school. And Hard Rock cafes and Six Flags over New England, the whole 9 yards, right? Scourge of our existence. And one of the interesting things to come now that I'm designing, within so-called informal settlements, is there's so many overlaps between what I did, and not in a kind of a surfacey way, but when you design amusement parks, you have to move quickly from graphic design to urban planning to architecture to interior design, and be able to operate very quickly, because we were very expensive. You're well paid. By the way, if you want to get paid well, go design amusement parks. We were paid incredibly well. But because we were paid incredibly well, we only got to do the projects for a very short period of time, so we had to be quick. And so that quick iteration, switching scales all the time, communicating your ideas in a few strokes of the pencil as possible, all of those skill sets. Now, am I smart enough to say I choreographed that whole thing because I knew I'd be doing this, 10 years down the road? No. But I was smart enough to take advantage of every opportunity I've been given. And I think that's actually the better question, is that you can only go so far of setting yourself up, but there is no perfect position out there. It's much more important that you take advantage of whatever position presents itself to the fullest of your ability, I think.
So I would challenge you to come up with the perfect position. And that is really hard. No, to propose it in your mind. And it's not out there. But then I would say, what skill sets do I need to do? What I'd say is, what do I like to do? I mean, that's, what I want to do. That should be easy. To say, what's the perfect position might be intimidating. Say, what do I like to do? What do I want to go to the office and do every day, or not go to the office and do? Never go to the office, right? Whatever it may be. Then you back down all the skills you need. There are a lot of those skills you could get in I don't know you, but for a lot of people, a big office is going to be great for a lot of those skills, right? So wherever you can get those skills is good. You're checking off your list, right? Now what you don't want to do is stay there, because then you didn't get to, So it's a good way to keep your career like this job. There's a lot I don't like about it, but I'm really working towards my end goal here. And also what Scott said, I would agree with, is like, but this isn't day one. Go back and look at your resume and say, well, I've already got this stuff, just like the amusement parks, or like I was saying about Joe Junius, taking his kitchen design and now serving the public. He's not starting over a career. He's taking this amazing expertise. And, it's interesting he made it get fed, because I actually was thinking Joe probably didn't want to do kitchens for the rest of his life, but he could have built on the kitchens and then built that into something else, I mean, I could have easily gone from migrant housing to something else. I just really love serving. I really respect them. I just love them, so that's who I want to serve. I admire them, it's interesting work. So anyway, that's not the point. So that's how I would, that's how I suggest people think about it.
Thank you, guys.
I think the other thing you shouldn't underestimate is I keep saying relationships, but the value of the people that you're working with in that office. I mean, I very quickly got tired of some of the work I was doing, but I'm still in contact and still colleagues with a lot of the people in all those different offices that I've worked with over the years. And one of the biggest assets for us in terms of working in our 4-block neighborhood is that we have a crazy network of people like all around the world at this point that that we can connect with. And so whether it means I don't know, raising funds for a skate park, or help grant writing, or understanding a sound studio detail, or figuring out how to restructure a roof when we're taking down like the main bearing wall. I don't know, like there are a million different skills that go into a lot of even the small projects we do, and the fact that we can sort of like call people up or send emails and get just tap into that network in 100 different ways. It's really huge.
Well, she also mentioned Gensler. Do you know who comes to our Public Interest Design Institutes every time? Gensler employees. And you know what? I don't know what we're cooking up, but it's going to be the next big thing is Public Interest Design and Gensler. So there are a lot of people like yourself at big firms that have this interest, and the firms, I think, seem to respect that. Perkins and Will has the best mission statement about public interest design I ever read in my life. It's on all their cards. I don't know exactly what they're doing, but I think there's, even at big firms, I think there's you know, big firms want young talent, and you guys, a lot of you want that, so.
Okay, I could have one final question. Really one big, huge, one final question.
No pressure.
You recognize a public need or a problem in a community and you try to address it. How do you measure the impact of your work on a community after the fact?
Well, I think this is also, I mean, besides the participation methods, this is something we need to do. Because let me tell you something. Here's where architects get screwed. Okay, we do the building, we take the picture, you know, first day, and then we're out of the picture. So whatever happens in that building, we're not given credit for. Okay, great things happen in that building. Nobody thinks that has anything to do with the architect or the designer. That's where we lose out in people thinking, oh, this daycare is awesome because the architect did this, right? So we need to pull ourselves into that impact and say, oh yeah, well, that performing arts center that I showed is so amazing because the architect, nobody would do that project. He lives in Durham. Durham's dead downtown, North Carolina. He said, I'll be the developer because no other developer would do it. So he was the architect developer. This is one of these hybrid. A lot of this stuff is like me. I'm a nonprofit housing developer designer, you know. So it's like being the kitchen guy, you know, nonprofit. There's a lot of hybrids. Anyway, the point of it is that we need to get credit for what happens, and measuring that, it's not that hard. It really isn't. Lawrence Chang did he put two nonprofits together in Chinatown in Boston. Neither one of them could build a building themselves. One taught classes at night, one taught kids classes in the daytime. Put them together, they built he designed the Chinatown Community Education Center. I said, Lawrence, what results have this building done? He said, I don't know. I said, well, go back and ask them. In one conversation with them, they talked about the number of volunteers that it increased, the amount of funding that it increased, the number of programs that it increased. I mean, he didn't even know what metrics to ask them, but they had this bunch of results, improvements that had happened. So we're really bad at this. There's no doubt. And unfortunately, it's our loss because we're not associated with results. So even like construction jobs, you know, that's all up there. You have a seed project, you get credit for the construction jobs that project created. I mean, not you personally hired them, but the project did that. These are the things we need to start taking credit for. Anything great that happens in that building, it's part of the impact of that project. Now, we also should be held accountable if things are bad, right? So that's the other side. If things don't work out and something fails, we need to be held accountable for that as well. So it's a whole new field, just like the participation and measuring results. But really, the main thing is just to ask the question. And just like Lawrence, or just like some of these projects that are successful in ways you didn't imagine, you know, maybe you say we want to increase outdoor activity in our neighborhood. So whether it's a skate park or whether it's a rap video, I mean, these are all increases in activity outside, right? So you don't have to start by saying, I want to create a project that's going to create a rap video, right? I mean, you didn't know that. I'm being foolish, but.
I think the answer is expanding what we means. I don't think we means architects, because we're actually this needs to be done, but architects are actually very poor at charting these results. Yeah. But fortunately, there are experts in said field, and we just have to walk across the quad to find them. Right now, as I sit here, there are our nonprofit partners in Bolivia continue to take the vending education carts around and document the results, which are successful, which are not. They keep feeding me this information, right? So I'm not there. And to be frank, they're probably better at charting the results and the successes and failures than I am. And then when I arrive, you know, this summer, the work will benefit from the insight of an expanded we.
I think in our case, a lot of it's anecdotal. I mean, again, we're in sort of a unique position because we live in the neighborhood, so sometimes it's, you know, a matter of a neighbor telling us a story when we see them or telling someone else, and then it gets passed on. It's a lot of word of mouth and informal. And one of the good things about the grant writing process that we've kind of been forced to do is start to formalize some of those, or record some of those results. So, you know, when you start applying for like National Endowment for the Art grants, they want to know, like, they want numbers. They want to know, like, how many people are you serving and how many people are involved in this project, and then they want you to figure out how to measure the results. And one of the interesting things about getting caught up in that kind of like policy world is that they do demand metrics. And again, it's you know, it's kind of funding based. If someone's going to give you money, they want some kind of measure of success or whatever they want to call it. And sometimes it makes sense and sometimes it doesn't. You know, sometimes you kind of feel like you're just filling in some blanks. But in a lot of cases, it's been good for us to have to evaluate, you know, if we spend this much money on something, like, is it going to have enough of an impact, especially considering sort of like that value, market value of real estate in our neighborhood or the median income in our neighborhood. You know, for us, it's sort of a reality check and a responsibility check for what we're doing with what we've been able to access. But I think, you know, some of the more interesting ways of measuring this stuff is informal. You know, talking to families, talking to kids. Mitch always likes to tell the story that he was painting something, I don't remember what he was painting something outside one time, and he was sort of like doing a weird pattern scheme, and one of the kids from the neighborhood came up to him and was like, what are you doing, Mitch? And he was like, oh, I'm just trying something out. It's an idea I had. And the kid is kind of like, I think you should try something different. And it's like, that's not like a metric, but it's sort of, you know, the fact that you basically just had like art criticism from the 12-year-old who lives a block away. It's sort of, that to us was a total success. But I think evaluation is important, and, you know, at some level having some kind of like formal understanding of, and I think it does come back to responsibility, like what are you putting out into the world and who is it serving, and whether you hit the mark or miss the mark isn't necessarily the point. It's just understanding what just happened. I mean, we encourage failure. Like, you're not going to know if you don't try, and if you're afraid to fail, then you're not going to try some of the ideas that might be the best. Like I mean, and again, we're working in sort of a unique condition, but it's like try again, and you know, otherwise you don't know, and you just keep doing the same exercise over and over.
Bryan, I want to give you one final word. I want to say.
I would just, I love Scott's point that it is we. Is that how you said it?
Expanded we.
The expanded we, yeah. I'll finish with that.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone, for